Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're going to just take a minute or so, let people come in before we officially get started. Thanks for spending some of your Friday with us. We appreciate you being here. Just going to give it one more minute and then get started. Okay, Jason, let's start the recording. Hello, everybody, and welcome to CoachSource's First Friday webinar for May. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As always, I extend a particularly warm welcome to all our current clients, as well as our not yet clients on the call. I'm Mary Dombrowski, SVP of Client Engagement with CoachSource. I lead both our current client service teams, as well as focus on creating new client partnership. For those of you not familiar with CoachSource, we are the largest pure play global executive coaching firm. We have been in business for 19 years. We have over 1,200 coaches globally. We deploy for leadership transformation, typically at the director level and above, including C-suite and board. CoachSource hosts webinars such as this on the first Friday of every month. At CoachSource, we believe that inspiring leadership transforms organizations. Our monthly gatherings are dedicated to empowering HR business partners and leaders of talent inside organizations with insights, strategies, and expert guidance on leveraging executive coaching to drive organizational excellence. If you have specific topics you would like to see us cover, please email me, mary@coachsource.com. I would love to hear from you. In this month's First Friday webinar, we're continuing our theme of discussing the most frequently addressed leadership traits in executive coaching. This month, influencing others. The word influencer has taken on a new meaning in our current lexicon, but we're not talking about the kind of influencer who goes viral on TikTok or gets paid to pose with skincare products. As you're well aware, the stakes of influencing in corporate leadership are a little higher. Taking a recent example, for instance, if somebody at Boeing had been a little more effective at influencing across departments or functions or power lines, perhaps we wouldn't be talking about a door panel flying off midair or multiple plane crashes that put lives at risk and shook public trust and shareholder confidence. And I realize that may be an extreme example, but it does demonstrate the power of influence in a very tangible way. Influencing others in a business setting isn't about visibility. It's about impact. It's about gaining buy-in without authority, shaping outcomes through trust and credibility, and moving strategy forward when you don't control all the levers. And I'm very happy to say we have again the perfect guest, one of our amazing CoachSource qualified executive coaches, Neela Bettridge, to lead our conversation on influencing others. Neela is a successful senior executive and entrepreneur with over 25 years experience, including 16 years as a highly qualified and innovative business leadership, team coach, and facilitator. Neela works with C-suite executives and senior teams, turning good leaders into outstanding executives. Prior to becoming a coach, Neela worked at a senior level with blue chip multinationals. She has also been involved in successful startup businesses, consulted for some of the world's biggest organizations on ethical, social, and environmental risk. Through her coaching, Neela empowers all types of leaders and their teams to be inclusive, to realize potential, and manage rapid, complex change. Neela and I will talk for about 45 minutes. We welcome you to put your questions into chat during the conversation. We'll also open for Q&A later in the session. So Neela, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. So Neela, in executive coaching, influencing others comes up again and again, but it can mean different things to different people. So let's start with, how do you define influence in the context of senior leadership coaching?
Yeah, great question, Mary. And it is coming up more and more within my coaching, not just globally. I think it's the ability to really shape thinking, drive decisions, and inspire action, but not through authority or hierarchy, but through relationship, through clarity, through credibility, and actually, most importantly, relational connection. And that really is at the bottom of this. How do we make relationship in order to influence others? And it's not Machiavellian in any sort of way. It's not about strong arming people. It's about really getting under the skin of what it is that those people need in order not just to get what we want out of something, but also to enable them. So it's very much an equal relationship.
So understanding what the other person is seeking from it, in addition to what you're trying to achieve.
Exactly. And that then gives us the capacity as a leader to move people and the organization and the department towards some meaningful outcomes. And in our matrixed environments that we're operating in, this is particularly important because we don't have always the luxury of being the decision maker or having complete authority on something. So influence is terribly important with leaders today.
Can you dive a little bit deeper into that about why this ability to influence others is so critical? Just as you're talking about cross-functional alignment, the leading without authority, these matrixed environments, could we just dive into that a little bit more deeply?
Yeah, a lot of the people that I work with now operate within matrixed environments. So there's shared ownership. And a lot of organizations, as you know, Mary, are going through significant transformational change, whether it's digital or, all sorts of areas are changing. And therefore, how do you use influence to actually get things through in a matrix organization? And I think this is why it's really coming up more and more and more within particularly my work when I'm working with senior leaders around influence and actually understanding who are the stakeholders that I need to be getting involved. And, depending on the topic and depending on the area of transformation, the stakeholders may change. And one has to be very thoughtful about that. And also, do you need to be linking in countrywide stakeholders, regional stakeholders, global stakeholders? And often you're not just dealing with stakeholders within your own division. You might actually be leading a program that needs legal, financial, all sorts of areas of the business, product. So cross-functional collaboration, in my view, is becoming very much the norm. And it's particularly important when you're doing innovation and transformation. And understanding how to use influence and actually also understanding cultural nuance in influence is very, very important indeed. And also the other thing, and we were talking about it just before we started today, there is a lot of speed in the system now, a lot of ambiguity and complexity. So we have to be very thoughtful about how we do that influence within that sort of macro context that leaders are having to operate in. It's difficult for them.
It's such an important point because we move at such a fast pace today, and yet we need to still be thoughtful about what we're doing. And it's balancing, the accuracy and speed
Yes.
in that. And just I was introduced the other day to a 2-grid matrix with the idea of like, how consequential is this decision? How reversible is this decision, right? And that when it's high consequence and hard to reverse, go slow.
Exactly. And, actually, it has a lot of relevance, that, Mary, to influence, because actually what you're talking about there, I heard it as, how do you prioritize things when you've got a lot of speed in the system, when you need to be moving at pace, when things are complex, and actually you're needing to influence. And so being also thoughtful about that. And of course, for leaders, enabling the space and time to do that is very, very important. Not always easy either.
Right. Well, yeah, not much is easy these days.
Exactly.
But that's why you're in senior leadership, is to handle complex issues and difficulties.
Indeed.
Now, when we spoke earlier in the week, or maybe it was last week, you had mentioned to me that there's three different types of influencers inside organizations, and you referred to
Yes,
them as actors, blockers, and oil.
yeah,
So
oil, yes,
can you walk through what each of these mean and how leaders
yes.
can navigate them effectively?
Yeah, absolutely great. So this is the way when I'm working with somebody, this is the way I get them to start thinking about the system. If you like, actors are the visible movers in an organization. They're the people who are very obvious and make things happen. And actually, sometimes they can be an asset or they can be a distraction, but they tend to drive momentum in change and transformation. They're quite obvious in a system. And actually, when you're dealing with them, it's important to know who they are and that you involve them early and you really engage them and get their buy-in into whatever it is that you're dealing with. And of course, not all actors have the same power. So being thoughtful about that,
Mm.
you know, how much influence and power does this actor have? The second type of individual within a system is what I call the blockers. And they are sometimes, I also think about them as the hidden resistance. And actually, sometimes, depending on our attitude to conflict, we may want to avoid them. And I always, when I'm working with a team or an individual, I say, please do not avoid them because they're less visible, but they may be highly influential behind the
Mm.
scenes. And what they will not challenge directly in a system, but what they will provide is a real passive resistance, and you will find you won't be able to move forward. And so, you know, they can come from all sorts of areas. They can be functional leaders. They can be people actually affected by the change that you're thinking about. So one needs to be really thoughtful about those people and or groups of people and how you deal with them. And I always think that the best way to deal with them is they are resisting because they are worried about something.
Sure.
So, therefore, how do you build the relationship with them? How do you build their trust? How do you get them on side? You may have to spend much, much more time with them, but actually, it's terribly important because it could be the difference between your initiative being successful or not being successful. So, those are those people. And then there's the third group, which I call the oilers or the trusted connectors. And they are the people, I think, that make things move. And then they're not always in power positions, but they can be really important. And they tend to be trusted people within a system. They understand the culture of the system. They are very good at building bridges in a system. And they can be quiet voices. And so what we can do is just go for all the actors and think perhaps about the resistors, but we don't actually think about the oilers, and they can be very powerful. And actually empowering those group of people in your influencing strategy is very important. And what I would do is I would get you to map those people on a system so that we
Mm.
actually understand where the pressures are coming in terms of your influencing strategy. So yeah, it's a really quick way of reading a system. And if you what happens is you get into that system, you will find other people popping in and out, and it may change as your project, you know, moves forward.
So interesting. I'm just thinking, I'm going to go a little off script for a second because I'm curious about when you go to work with an individual, is this something that you're doing as one of the first things inside of, say I'm new in a role, and
Yeah,
is this an exercise that you might have somebody go through just um, irrespective of a decision that may have to be made or an initiative that you're trying to advance? Or do you go through this exercise for each initiative that a person is trying to advance?
yeah, great question. It depends, is the
Okay.
answer.
Hmm.
It's part of my brief. A leader will say to me, I've got X, Y, and Z. I need help in thinking about how I'm going to influence in this matrix system. But
Mm-hmm.
if I'm working with a CEO, for instance, or indeed a board that is doing something tricky, it would be part of what I would be doing with them. But
Mm-hmm.
because we as coaches are led by the coachee, often in their brief, I wouldn't start there. I would
Okay.
take my lead from them. But if I felt it was missing, if I could see a block, excuse the pun, but if I saw a block, I would actually include it within the work that I was doing with them. Yes.
Great. Okay. Um, Fantastic. All right. So let's talk about what are some of the common business challenges
Yes.
where the ability to influence becomes a decisive factor in success or failure.
Yeah. Leading transformation is an
Mm,
absolute critical one. And it really, really is important that you understand how to influence and who the stakeholders are and where the power and influence is in that system. And it is a system. It's like an organism almost. Um, and the other place where it is actually increasingly people are needing to manage up and across with their peers and bring their peers alongside them. And it may have nothing to do with transformation, but it may be, managing people, managing their work, whatever it may be. How do you use influence to do that? When you are thinking about alignment across very diverse stakeholders, and that may just not be internal to your organization. You may indeed be thinking about how it's linking out externally to customers, investors, whatever it may be. And that is actually very important because it becomes the glue, if you like, influence that actually brings the system together. When you're doing any form of innovation or risk taking, uh, very important skill to have in terms of influence. And indeed, actually, I recently did something with somebody where it was about a crisis and there was a reputational issue at stake. And
mm.
again, we used influence within that sort of thing. So it comes in many different ways. And increasingly, I think it's an absolute core skill for any leader to have, to be really honest with you.
Well, sure. And we think about it in terms of I have an initiative that I would like to advance, and who else do I have to influence in the organization to do that? But equally, if you have a team reporting to you, you need to be able to influence them to do the work that you want them to do.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
You really, really do. And how do you influence your team? Actually, the
Hmm.
same thing applies. And I think, it's one of the things that I think that needs to become the way we do things round here is how you teach influence within a business system. So people get used to the feedback loops and the reflection routes. And, so that becomes part of the way we do things and the relational piece of influence. So they're practicing it from literally when they join and all the way through.
It is all relationship, isn't it? So
It's
much.
all relationship, and it cannot be. Um, it can't. It's an odd thing because obviously you're influencing to enable something that you're trying to do, but if you approach it in a way which is trying to control or manipulate, that is not influence. And so I always, when I'm working with somebody, I'm always talking about making sure that it's balanced in how you
Mm,
influence.
great point. That's a great point. So, can you share an example from your work where a leader's effectiveness dramatically improved through growing their influence skills? You don't
Yeah.
have,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
doesn't have to be a
I,
specific, right? But yeah.
I actually do have a specific, but obviously won't mention the name. I'll just talk about the area of work. Global pharmaceutical company. I was working with a very senior leader. She was in their engineering area to do with AI, and she had a huge transformation program that she's been trying to get through, and she was literally hitting brick walls all over the place. And actually it was really affecting her relationships, and not just with her team, her peers, and how she was being perceived, if you like, above. Because of course, an aspect of influence is also leadership presence, yeah, which becomes increasingly important when we are going through a system in our work. Now, what became clear when I started working with her is that she was a very heavily logic data-based individual, as you would expect with what the work it was that she was doing. So she actually mapped the stakeholders in a fashion that she'd only included the actors. She hadn't included any of the blockers or the oilers. And there was no relational work being done at all within this influencing strategy. So what I worked with her on is actually building the trust with the actors, the oilers, and the blockers, going back to brass tacks almost, and actually looking at this in a totally different way and spending time at the beginning. So we had to go slow to go fast. And this project had been stalled for ages and ages and ages. It took us about 6 months to actually work this through with regular meetings, changing the tone, being much more relational. And what she did was she spent time building informal networks to build what I call relational equity. And she worked also on her messaging, because messaging is very important in influence. You cannot use the same message for everybody. You have to be thinking about the individual or the group of people involved and actually what they need, and then tying it to organizational goals. Anyway, what then happened was she reframed all her proposals from this very data heavy, logical type proposal. And it became much more about a patient-centric story. And so it landed emotionally and relationally. And so the project, is up and going. People bought into it. Every single person will buy into it. But in the main, people bought into it. So it's now on its way. So that was a real successful one. And people often ask me, do you have to be a certain kind of person to do influencing? And the answer to that is no. What you need to be doing is really concentrating and thinking about the messaging and the relationship and what needs to be done in order to create that foundation stone.
Well, it also sounds like in that example, when changing it to being sort of customer focused or client focused, that then can tie back into the mission values of the organization, right? And tie back like, what are we all here to do after all?
Exactly, and that's what she was able to do with that patient-centered story. It tied back into the organization's goals, but it touched the heart, so they could see the link between the purpose, the organizational goal, and it wasn't just all about data and logic. And that was very important in getting the people bought in.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Brilliant. Okay, and so let's look on the flip side of it, of what goes wrong when somebody isn't strong in influence and the consequences for the team or the organization.
Well, in my experience, what starts to definitely happen is trust and engagement erode. And that can start happening at all levels in the organization. So you'll often see that the teams won't be performing particularly well. The relationships won't be working. The decision-making will slow down or completely stall. And you'll find these real blocks in these matrix organizations where things just won't shift. And people go round and round and round in circles. And I often get brought in at that point. The other thing that can happen is that people start really operating in their silos. So the enterprise level thinking stops and people concentrate on their expert silos, which of course is not useful for an organization which is wanting to do bold things. You want enterprise level thinking, and influencing strategy enables enterprise level thinking. Actually, for the leader themselves, I think their leadership presence, what they stand for, how they show up, and their credibility seriously suffers as well, because they get it's linked so much to trust, I think, influence. It's that sort of that that piece that we can't quite put our finger on, but we know it when it's not there. And I think that is actually the areas that really suffer when you've got this going on and it's not happening.
Yeah, and we always like to tie back to business outcomes, right? Of the consequences of these situations. So what I hear you talking about is, like a team not functioning, so deadline might be missed. We did a webinar on a team, a case study of a team coaching engagement, where in that instance, the team had they totally botched a product release, and it was a very visible action that happened in the marketplace. And so then we were brought in, a coach was brought in to help with that team. And I always have to remind people that we don't have to wait until the team is not functioning to call in coaching. We have clients where we do a mini team engagement at the formation of the team so that we can get those agreements together and get that team off to a good start. So we just want to remember that we don't have to wait till things are crashing and burning to take.
I think that's a point really well made, Mary. In fact, it's so much better to get involved at the beginning.
Right, exactly. But I also, so we're talking about deadlines that get missed that can tie back to revenue. If initiatives are losing, an initiative can be tied to cost savings or can be tied to revenue growth, or, product launches, as we were talking about. So that's where we get into like really tangible, where you can tie back to what is the value of bringing in an intervention to stop this, or to taking proactive action so that you don't get to that place. And there was one other, the other tie-in that I always like to bring back to is when you've got bad leaders, or I shouldn't say bad, I don't want to use that word, ineffective leaders that aren't at their top function, that can lead very much to retention issues of the people beneath them or around them.
Definitely. And I think influence is one of the key things that can actually affect that as well, retention. How do we keep people with us as we go through our leadership journey? Either the people that work for us, the people who are our peers, and how do we actually engage with the people above us in order to create change, to move forward, to be an effective leader. And we are role models, aren't we, as leaders? So people are watching how you're navigating this. When I'm working, I'm always talking about this. You need to be really thoughtful about how you do your influence, because you are a role model within your organization.
Right. And retention, I mean, retention is such a high cost to any organization. The productivity you lose when you lose somebody, especially somebody you didn't want to lose, right? The cost to replace them, the cost of the work that doesn't get done, all of that goes into play. So I know that that's a high focus of all organizations right now, is making sure that you're keeping your really best people. So let's move into that. Let's talk about, for our audience of HR leaders and heads of talents, how can they recognize the potential for influence in a leader? Especially, we always want to talk about, especially among those who aren't naturally outspoken or charismatic, those quiet performers. We talked a lot about this last month with executive presence, of how when somebody doesn't clearly, demonstrate that, how do you know they still have the potential for it? And to pull those people out. And, I'll just add one more caveat to it, which is that much of our work is in the tech and pharma sectors, and where you have people that have very high technical skills then being put into positions to be leaders of people. And that's one of the key things, as you know, that we help with when we're working in organizations. So let's talk about how you can identify your prospective leaders.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception often, isn't there, Mary, that you have to be somehow an extrovert or louder to be a good influencer. And my experience is, I mean, people are wonderful and varied. So But I have experienced the quieter leaders who are absolutely brilliant influencers. And what makes them really good influencers is that they have this quiet presence that instills trust. They're consistent in their approach. They're not up and down. They tend to be quite consistent, and they have credibility. And we know that we can have quiet credibility. But what really marks them out, in my view, is that you're looking for those individuals within an organization that are trusted by their peers across functions, for instance. And they're consistently sought after for input. There are people within, and sometimes they're called quieter ones, and often outside their formal scope. The second area that I think makes somebody good at influencing, and for people looking for talent in this area should be looking at, is people who have got very strong listening skills and framing skills, so that they actually hear what others say rather than just put their point of view forward. So that's another key thing, I think, which is really important. And also what you're looking for is the ability to build relationship across all sorts of levels of the organization. And some people are very, very good at that. They truly are good relationship builders. Another thing I think, which is an interesting clue, is who has fellowship in your organization? Who do people choose to follow and support? And even when they don't have to, and actually keeping an eye out for those sort of people. And also, who are the people within your organization that are really respected for their consistency and their integrity? Because it is likely that they also will be, I'm not saying all of them will be great at influencing, but they're great qualities to look for when you're thinking about people who can influence in organizations. Bearing in mind what I said, this is not about manipulation of people.
Right.
It has to be based, on, you have to do it with integrity.
Yeah.
Has that answered your question, Mary?
Yeah, I think it really is helpful that you just start to kind of find people who naturally become a node in some way, right? A center, and are reaching out as they're moving up the ladder. You can see that they're naturally forming bridges to others. And I think that's
Yes.
a great thing to be able to look for.
And it's
I
not
think,
about personality, it's about their impact. I think that's the difference. Yeah, we can often think that influencing is about your personality. Actually, I would be looking for the impact that individual has within the organization.
I think too, when you talk about active listening and that part of it, that to me demonstrates a natural curiosity. And I
Yes,
think
exactly.
that can also be a great trait to look out for.
It is, and that when you talk to me, I'm actually listening to you. I really am listening. Yeah, and that you have to have an element of curiosity to do that,
Exactly.
rather than be interested in what you have to say. So, yeah, it's that give and take of relationship.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So in your experience, how does executive coaching accelerate a leader's ability to influence others differently than traditional leadership training or mentorship?
Well, coaching, as you know, Mary, it's very individual. It's very deeply reflective, and it's very focused on real-time behavior change. And it's totally and utterly tailored to the individual's context, the organization they're working for. And so you're not doing a generalized leadership training program on it. You're actually responding to the needs of that individual in the moment. So from that point of view, it's very targeted. It also, in my view, surfaces blind spots for the leader in real time. And all the coaches I know who are really good at their roles have a relationship of trust with their coachees, that they're able to hold the mirror up and go, have you noticed that you are doing X, Y, and Z? Now, this might be really useful to a leader because I think influencing is about nuance. And sometimes we don't see that nuance because we live in our bodies and we can't see it. And that's all about how you show up in a meeting, what's the emotional impact you're having on another person, how do you respond when somebody resists you, all of those things. So coaching can be really, really helpful. And of course, in communication and understanding how you communicate when it's not all going your way. I think, as you know, coaching is not just about the skills that you have, and we work with highly skilled people, but it's actually about your internal capacity, the container that you have to hold, and how you get triggered, how you manage resistance, how you respond to things that come from, all sorts of directions. I think coaching is really helpful in building the internal capacity. It's real time as well. So, I like to work with individuals where they bring real things in and we work on something real that they're about to do, and they go off and they try it out. And then they get very reflective and curious about how that went. And then they bring it back into session and we go, well, that went well. That didn't go so well. Let's have a noodle about the other. So, I think coaching is really useful, and it can really, really accelerate behavior change, because at the bottom of all of this is self-awareness. The more self-aware we become, the more thoughtful we become as we reach the junction where we usually do behavior A. I think coaching gives them the option of thinking, actually, I'm going to do behavior B today because I think that's going to serve me better. So I think it's a very it's a fantastic intervention for somebody who is really needing to deal with something which is specific to them.
Right. Okay. Okay. And, we do a lot of times we're layering coaching over a set leadership development program, right? And so the individuals are going in, we've got groups of, 30, 50, sometimes 100 leaders that are going through a program inside an organization at the same time. And the organization decides, we're going to offer you, in one case, they're actually, they can take a mentor and or a coach. So they've got the option to do one of those. How is that intervention different when you're looking at a mentor versus a coach, or how do they work hand in hand if you're doing both?
I think coaches can work really brilliantly with mentors, actually, and I do quite a few of those with my senior leaders, because in my view, and you may, I'm open to challenge on this, the mentor is an expert that has much more experience than the coachee, and therefore can help them with situations which are particularly related to their industry, their work, whatever it may be. The coach has a different role. The coach is there to actually support self-awareness, behavior change, understanding of what can be seen as the softer skills that are required in a leadership role, but I think are absolutely critical. Because, you can be the most competent leader in the world, but actually, if you don't have leadership presence, can't influence, unclear on how to develop vision, whatever it may be, then actually you're not going to be very successful. You just will be very clever. So,
That's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it. All right, that was really helpful. So let's talk now about how does a senior leader's ability or inability to influence others affect not just the high-level strategic outcomes, but team engagement. We talked a little bit before about retention,
yes,
but at the lower level. So, fostering, as you talked about, the clarity, the trust, the followership that helps to retain the talent.
Yeah, there's several areas actually. It doesn't just shape that strategy at the top, because it does cascade. all the way down the organization. So as you say, team engagement, trust, all of that, retention. I think the first place I would start with that is influence shapes clarity of direction and also alignment. So sometimes I work with leaders who are unclear about the direction in which they're going and are not influencing. And so everybody feels at sixes and sevens and doesn't actually understand what they're supposed to be doing in order to help that, whatever that is. And actually, influence helps translate strategy into meaning, I think, because it actually it gives color, it gives meaning to strategy and my part in it. And actually, what do you require from me? I think influence done well can also really drive psychological safety and trust. And in high performing teams, you will see very high psychological safety, and they often tend to be with leaders who influence through listening, transparency, and they create a culture. Not that people don't get held accountable, not at all, but they are listened to. And when they make mistakes, it's fed back and they learn from it and they use influence. So, you know, that can sometimes, as we know, some situations get replaced by coercion or a very authoritarian type leadership. And that's when the trust erodes. I think also it's worth remembering that although we might be working with a senior leader, how they influence will affect middle managers. So I call them the middle. And they're a very important part of an organization. And they take their cues, if you like, from the senior leaders. And if they see their senior leaders engage, align, move forward, they are much more likely to do that as well. So it's actually really important. And where I see senior leaders who bulldoze, don't align, etc., you end up with this middle group who actually there's quite toxic microcultures that start being created.
Right.
And I think the other final thing I'd like to say about influence and it's why I think it's really good is it creates commitment but not necessarily compliance, and they're different. Yeah. So if I am influenced appropriately and I buy into something, I'm much more likely to be committed to it rather than just comply with you because you're my boss. And I think that's a better way of actually getting accountability, in my view.
That's a great point. I mentioned to you that I had gone to a conference earlier this week about managing remote work teams, and they did talk about hybrid teams as well. But we CoachSource are fully remote, and so I was interested from that perspective. And one of the things they stressed is that it's so important when your team is distributed and doing work still toward a common goal that everybody understands where are we going and what is my role in it. And that if people don't understand how exactly am I expected to contribute to the outcomes we're trying to achieve, that's where you get that lack of cohesion and the lack of advancement. So it's just something that I heard come out as you were talking about that, and sort of want to double click on it, as they say, for those that are working with distributed teams.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Very important with those sort of teams.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a little bit more to cover, but I do want to open it up to our audience for any questions that they have. There's a chat function, you can raise your hand. There's a Q&A function that you can submit a question. So whichever way people would like to tap into Neela's expertise and knowledge, we welcome that participation. And as we are opening the floor for questions, I want to remind our clients and our not yet clients that CoachSource is here as a thought leader and a strategic partner. And if you would like to talk further about how executive coaching can support your leaders in addressing your organization's business challenges, you're welcome to reach out to me, or if you are a current client, your client service director. Our next First Friday will be Friday, June 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern. We will be sending out a recording of this session to everyone who registered, and then we'll also have this posted on our website. Okay, so let's see, Neela, if we have, I don't see any questions. Now, I know this is typically a pretty chatty group, but today being a little bit shy, so we'll give you a few minutes. And while we're waiting, I'm going to ask one more question, which is, Neela, if you had one piece of advice for senior HR leaders who are working to develop the skill of influencing others at scale, what would it be?
I would say embed regular constructive feedback loops,
Mm,
and also really encourage reflective practice. I think that's a really important part, and this active listening skill, that all leaders are encouraged to do it, because I think these are foundation stones of good influencing skills.
but from a practical perspective, how do you put that into practice?
It can be integrated into daily work. It can be integrated into team meetings. It doesn't need to just be appraisals. It can be the way that all meetings that happen within an organization, you can actually have some sort of reflect. In fact, I work with an organization that actually does this. They have feedback sessions, just 5-minute feedback at the end of every meeting. How was that? What did we learn? What did we do well? What didn't we? And they reflect, and they actually listen to each other as they do it. It's just building that skill of also listening to another's point of view, not having to have your own way, and actually build muscle, if you like. It's like a muscle that has to be built. And it's not a one-off thing that you go to a training course and learn, over a weekend. It's something that is learned over a period of time. Some people have it very naturally, that relational skill, and some people need just a little bit more help. And I
Mm-hmm.
find that constructive feedback loops and reflective practice are very helpful in building that and thinking about the other's point of view. What do they need? What do they need? What are they worried about?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. So, Neela, I really appreciate your time with us today. I'm not seeing questions coming in, and
It's
so
okay. You must have
I'm going.
answered everything.
Wait, wait, that's right. We have left people with no questions, but we had one other. Let me just see. What guidance would you offer to leaders who are new to an organization and aiming to build influence from the outside? And from an organizational perspective, what practices or support mechanisms can be implemented to help leaders effectively integrate and accelerate impact?
Yeah. I think that I'll start with the second question actually first.
Mm,
I think actually to put every leader through whatever leadership programs that you're doing to incorporate the ability to be able to stakeholder map, to understand how to do that, how to actually think about power and influence within an organization, and actually all the different influencing strategies through work like a gentleman called Caldini, and how you actually go about actually influencing others. I think that's a sort of bedrock, if you like, if you're doing leadership training. I would say that first of all.
mhm,
I think for new leaders, if I work with a new leader, depending on their brief, it does depend on their brief. I think it's very important that they, first of all, sit back and actually see who everybody is without rushing into this. It's quite important because it's about relationship. You don't want to go in where angels fear to tread. You want to actually understand who all the players are and how it sits, and perhaps even get the benefit of some of your colleagues, if you've got a small group of colleagues, to actually understand more. But I would be saying to people who started in a company, make it your business to reach out to all of your peers, the people you're working for, the people below you that you are impacting with your work, so you get to know them, and don't just do it on a one-off. Make it a regular thing. And people often say to me, oh my God, that's going to take me so much time. But I think it's really time well spent, because actually then people get to know you, you get to know them, you understand what some of the pressure is that they're facing or not, and you can actually respond accordingly.
Well, and after all, I mean, you started with the stakeholder map, but unless you get to know all those people around you, how could you possibly do a stakeholder map?
Precisely, precisely.
Right.
Yeah, so you can learn the stuff, but you actually need to know how to populate it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a really great point that everybody should kind of have that stakeholder map in their mind. I'm even thinking I'm going to make my own stakeholder map when we leave the conversation. But and I'll just add on to that to say that when somebody new to an organization or new to a role is really an ideal time to bring in an executive coach. And sometimes we're doing that in a shorter amount of time rather than traditional 6 month. It might be a 3 month or 4 month, because it's that critical time of getting your feet under you and understanding, having that guide that is an objective, that is not somebody who hired you or is reporting to you or you're reporting to. Getting that outside perspective on how to be successful in the role and have that safe space to be vulnerable about what you don't know in a new role. And it is probably one of the most easily demonstrable ROI uses of executive coaching, is that leader that's new to a role and or new to an organization. So
Yes.
I'm going to do a shameless plug there for executive coaching. But okay, and then it looks like any advice on influencing the C-suite on organizational changes needed? There's interest, but let me just see, interest, but can't see what is possible. So when you're looking at, that influence of doing something differently, workforce planning, executive development, and taking a different tack to it, how how would you exercise in how to influence the C-suite on those kinds of critical matters?
Yeah. Obviously, I can't talk in depth about this because I need to
Right.
know more about the topic. However, there are some steps that I would be suggesting. I would be wanting to, depends how much relationship you have with those C-suite members. I would start with developing a relationship with each of them, and taking and picking, not doing it en masse, actually going one to one, if at all possible, with each and every one of them, and really understanding where the barriers might be, where the opportunities might be for that topic. So before I try and influence them on anything, I would be wanting to know what their view is around the topic area, first of all, because actually that's part of being able to influence well, and understanding, maybe do you need to be tweaking your plan? Is it actually going to be blown out of the water completely because it's a big no? Have you missed something? Is there something there that they're really worried about? So that's one-to-one relationship, if at all possible, depending on your relationships with the C-suite. That's where I would start. But don't start with trying to push it at them. I would start with trying to find out where they stand on that topic area, and where the opportunity is and where the obstructions might be.
And it may seem obvious to say, but also understanding how is it in support of the initiative? Like tie it back to how it
Yes,
advances whatever their initiatives are, right?
exactly,
And tie it back to the
exactly.
outcomes that are
Yeah.
trying to be achieved. Yeah,
And
that's
why it's
great.
important for the organization. Yeah.
Exactly, right. For the organization. Yeah, tying back to your earlier example about the patient-centric
Yes.
approach. Okay, so Neela, I'm going to thank you so much for joining us. I know it
Thank
is
you.
later in your day, and we want to let you get on with your weekend. And thank you, everybody, for spending your time with us today on Friday. As I said, we will send this out to you, and we look forward to seeing you the first Friday in June. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye, Neela.
Bye bye.